June Gachui, intellectual property lawyer. Welcome to the JSO interview.
Thank you very much, John.
To my understanding, intellectual property equals creations of the mind for which exclusive rights are recognized. So I read that and I say, I've come up with this wonderful brainwave that I'm going to create a machine that will allow the villagers in my home county to predict exactly when it's next going to rain, get rid of the floods in Budalangi forever. Does that constitute my intellectual property?
To a certain extent it does, John. The fact that you've come up with this idea is fabulous, but there's still an extra step or two possibly that you would need to take as the person who has come up with this idea. You would need to put it in a tangible format. The word we use is fixation. You would need to fix this idea in a piece of paper, a sort of concept note, or a guideline as to how this invention would actually see the light of day. Once that's done, you have something to take to one of our registration bodies that we have in Kenya, and you would say, this is the idea that I have fixated, here's my concept note, or a little drawing, if there is one, about what the design will eventually look like, and that is the document that is actually worthy of protection. By nature, IP doesn't just protect ideas, and that's where I agree with that definition.
Well, perhaps you could expand then. That was my sort of agitprop Google definition.
Yes.
Take it a step further, please.
I think the thing I would add to intellectual property is the angle or the arm of the law that protects creations of the mind that have exclusive rights granted to them once they are in a fixated format, is what I would add. So you have to fixate that expression. To give you a very quick idea, you and I can both have that same idea at the very same time. You want to do it for Budalangi, I might want to do it for somewhere else that is suffering from flooding, or in my home county as well. And at the point at which both of us have come up with that idea, if I manage to fixate mine before you and run to the Copyright Office or the KIPI office, which is the Kenya Industrial Property Institute, I would have a prior date to your registration. And that's where we try and encourage these inventors or creatives to take that step much faster than just saying, I have this wonderful idea.
So in other words, have we as a society been rather unknowledgeable, to put it mildly, when we hear that words like chiondo, kikapu are in fact Japanese or Chinese or Brazilian? We didn't get the message?
I think there's a lot of new knowledge that has come up. But I will say this about intellectual property in Kenya is, I believe, still in its infancy. It's one of those arms of the law that even lawyers are starting to understand in a bit more depth. I won't even start talking about judges, for example, because it came in a lot longer after, a large while longer after a lot of them had joined the bench, for example. So if the lawyers and the judges are still trying to figure it out, you can imagine what's happening to the wananchi down here. Because for them, they're creating and they're going about their business, but they may not have that knowledge of what is in the Copyright Act, for example.
So okay, I'll draw you. Is it possible to explain to the layman or woman just exactly the areas in which intellectual property pertains?
Okay, definitely. Let me try and simplify it as much as possible. Intellectual property has two main departments, let's say. We have the copyright angle that handles everything artistic, musical, literary, drama, for example, films. All of that would fall under copyright. The other arm of copyright law is industrial property, and that handles things like trademarks, which is the logo that you would see that associates a particular good or service with the consumer. If I go to the supermarket and I choose a particular brand of margarine over another, it's because I have managed to find an association with that good and myself. So that is the trademark protection of that logo. There's also things called utility models, which are basic gadgets that you would find, industrial designs, a model of a phone, for example, and finally patents, which are the mother of all intellectual property. They take much, much longer, and they would be things like pharmaceutical drugs, because they take long years of research to put those things together and come up with this particular drug. So that's the main two arms that we find. You'll find a lot more of the commercial driven companies would be more familiar with the industrial property side of things, because there's a bit more money that's required in terms of investment. But a song, I can write it on a piece of paper, and the piece of paper costs me, maybe 2-3 shillings. It's not a big expense. So I think that's the main dichotomy that people need to be aware of. I think in Kenya, in most African countries, we fall under copyright. That's where most of our creation would be found. In the West, for example, the ratio is completely reversed. You would find 80% is patent law, which is very heavy research and development, funds that have been, universities given grants to do research over 10 years to find out how to make this little pill, and very, very few sort of resources are dedicated towards, copyright, for example.
Can I take you back to this notion of Kenya being in the Stone Age, so to speak, and be rather personal as an artist myself?
Yes.
First of all, the idea that if you do something, then you get paid for it.
Yes.
So the Kenyan artist, in terms of what I do, maybe narration, voiceover, is to sign on the dotted line and saying, this gives the right for this particular advert to be played in 10 different countries for the rest of our living days. We have no tracking mechanism as to know when that will happen. But the essential thing is that I've been paid, and therefore I ought to be happy. How do you attach value to this mind-driven or voice-driven property? Property as a word suggests that my house is worth 4 million shillings today.
Yes.
In 5 years' time, it might be worth 6 million. What about my voice? What about my song? What about my play?
It's a very interesting question, actually, because the move in Kenya now, with the few intellectual property lawyers that there are, is to find out ways of valuing the IP, the intellectual property. You mentioned voiceovers, for example. I think it's important to clarify the payment that you would get on that day is predominantly for your time and the action of you recording whatever it is you're recording in studio. You also have attached to your copyright or your IP, because a work has been created, that recording has a life of its own, and that entitles you to sort of continued royalty payments. And we see this a lot more in the music industry, but it would apply to anything that is fixated, like a film, for example. You're acting on a film, you get paid for that initial 3 months that you're on a set, for example. But thereafter, every year and every time that play or that movie is played, rather, you are entitled as a rights holder to some sort of continued payment.
So
and
in this case, you're not sort of naming names and saying who the culprits are. I'm saying that in my area of expertise, the culprits must be A, advertising agencies, B, publishers. What is there to be done to bring them to book? Or you're going to say they're lovely people and they've got monopolies and let them continue the way they've been doing because it's all wonderful.
Well, I think the solution is to be able to...
I'm saying that your profession is failing us.
Oh, okay, I could take that on behalf of the profession, but to a certain extent. I think a lot of what has been assumed, even in the legal profession, is that yourself as the artist or the creative knows that this angle of the law or this area of the law exists. And yet, in terms of your practice over God knows how many years, it may not have come up. That signing on the dotted line was probably just a formality for you. So I'm not saying that there's only a failing on who you're calling the culprits, but I think also the creatives have an obligation, I would say, to inform and educate themselves. In terms of...
with respect, every single time that, again, one must personalize some of these things, then they come to life.
Sure.
Every single time there have been demands on my talents,
yes,
the question invariably is made, how much do you wish to be paid? Now, if I'm sitting with you in this studio interviewing you,
yes,
how am I to know what I should be paid for saying, you know, Fido dog biscuits are the best in the world?
Yeah.
How am I to create my own
value?
Right, maybe I should be paid 1 million shillings.
Maybe you should.
But it turns out to be more like 10.
Well,
so I'm asking,
yes.
I'm not being facetious.
No, I understand.
I'm saying, what are you doing for us? What do they call it? The civic education is the buzzword.
True.
What is the civic education currently in place in Kenya over the issue of intellectual property?
Well,
to the best of your knowledge.
To the best of my knowledge, there are initiatives that are targeting creative entrepreneurs under which you would fall. Okay?
So I am a creative
You are a creative entrepreneur because you are engaging in a sort of business that is under a creative domain. That's as simple as it is. In some domains, we call them the creative hustlers, but the idea is that they should be able to earn a living, as you rightly say, from this thing. And we have noticed on the legal fraternity side that there is a gap in this knowledge. We can set up firms and wait in our receptions, wait in our offices for our receptions to be full of people like you. And we don't know where you are, for example. We don't know that you don't know that there's intellectual property. So one of the initiatives, and you'll find a lot of these happening currently in Nairobi, is looking for a set of creative entrepreneurs and inviting them in for a sort of get information on your intellectual property protection and see how it can work for you, how to protect yourself against infringement, how to register what you own. Do you even know what intellectual property is? We've had people come and say, I want to patent my TV show. That isn't even possible because TV shows fall under copyright. So it shows that there is a huge, huge, huge gap. And I don't believe we've done enough. I think there's definitely need between bodies like the Kenya Copyright Board, and civic education or sensitization on copyright issues is largely under their mandate, and they are starting to do things like that. So I agree with you to an extent, but I also feel there needs to be participation from the creatives as well.